All right, so welcome to the party. Glad you guys could come. For those who have not been here before, my name's Chalmer, and we're going to cover a variety of things tonight from the Python conference that was held in Portland, Oregon about a week and a half ago. I'll walk you through just kind of an intro to PyHawaii for those who haven't been here, and then we'll talk about Pycon and what that entailed and some cool things that we learned from that. And so we'll get started. If you're interested in following, for those who are not in part of our meetup group, etc., if you're interested in following the adventures of PyHawaii, we do have a Slack channel, and if you send me an email, I can get you an invite for that. You can email me at info@pyhawaii.com. We have a meetup users group, and when we plan an activity or an event, a mini conference or a Django Girls workshop or a meetup like this, you can be plugged in through there. We have a web page, Facebook and Twitter, and we typically advertise out our events on kind of all of those channels. Tonight, as I said, we'll do some Pycon stuff. In the future, we've got a couple new sessions coming up. We're going to be looking at scraping some infographics using Python. We'll then also have a session on using Bokeh to plot some data, particularly focused on Julius Caesar's Gallic campaign. In terms of future-proofing PyHawaii, we are looking for some additional folks who might want to volunteer to help us with some things. We'll talk about that in a bit. For those who want to kind of get your Python on and are interested in doing a conference experience similar to what you're going to hear about tonight, PyOhio is coming up. As you probably guessed, it is in Ohio. PyOhio is kind of a smaller conference. It's about 450 some odd folks. A lot of the things that I talk about that happen at PyCon will happen at PyOhio in terms of the look and feel. We are looking at doing another mini conference here in Hawaii. We did one last year in November. We're looking at doing another one here sometime soon. We definitely need some help with that. We've been talking with some folks who are responsible for the PyData conferences about maybe kind of combining forces, but that has not been decided yet. We're still kind of up in the air. But as we get some details nailed down about PyHawaiiCon, we'll let you know. In terms of how you could help PyHawaii in general, we're always looking for folks to kind of help with planning, leadership. We have a variety of leadership roles that we're kind of narrowing down and finalizing. We look to have possibly kind of an election of sorts to get folks to take on some of these leadership roles. We're always looking for folks to do talks. You do not have to be a professional teacher. If you have a cool project and you want to spend 15 minutes demoing it and you used Python, we're totally down for that. So if you would like to share something, demo it, teach about it, you found a new module and you just love it to death, please let us know. Advertising, we tweet out, we Facebook, a variety of things, but getting more folks aware that PyHawaii exists can help. So if you see a tweet or a Facebook update, or you get a meetup invite and you think you know somebody who might be interested, please share those things out for us. We'd really appreciate that. Our sponsors, the Iolani School, has been very gracious and has donated this space to us month after month. Dark Art of Coding has provided some financial support to PyHawaii, as has Booz Allen Hamilton, and High Capacity has been a longtime supporter of all the things that we do. So that's kind of intro to PyHawaii, and let's go look at something else. Let's go do some PyCon related stuff. All right. So every year PyCon is held in a random city around the globe. They do kind of 2-year stints. So this year PyCon was in Portland, Oregon. It'll be there again next year. I'm not sure what location will be in the year after that. You ask, what is PyCon? We're going to cover a little bit about that and what that means. I will then walk you through some of my favorite talks, and we'll look at some beginner level talks, some intermediate level talks, and some advanced, and I'll show you how you can get access to each of those. And then at the end, we're going to have some free time, and we're going to look at a platform called Coding Game, where you can actually compete. And before we kind of move on, I want to show you that, so that way folks can, if you're interested, you can set up accounts, etc. So Coding Game, the spelling is a little odd, C-O-D-I-N-G-A-M-E, Coding Game. If you get an account, you can tell it, for example, your favorite programming language, and when you do a puzzle, it puts you into a user interface that will allow you to solve the puzzle in your language. You can change languages at any time. I recommend you start at puzzles. They have a nice tutorial to walk you through the user interface, what's there, what you do, how you solve a puzzle. And then tonight, when we get done with kind of the talk, I'm going to sit down and get into the Clash of Code. And Clash of Code will give you very simple puzzles, and they'll give you about 10 minutes to solve them. And you'll be put into a lobby with up to 7 of your closest friends, and you guys bang it out head to head and see who can either solve the puzzle the fastest, or if they give you the shortest code puzzle, a type of puzzle, you have to be able to solve the puzzle in the shortest amount of code, and they count by characters. Or the other option they'll give you is they'll give you an input and they'll give you an output, and you have to write some sort of an algorithm that will provide the right output given an input. And they randomly pick what type of puzzle they throw you into. It could be the timed one, it could be shortest code, it could be input versus output. But anyway, we'll be doing that. So if you want to make an account on Coding Game and join me in competing afterwards, that'd be awesome. All right, so back to Pycon. All right, Pycon in a nutshell, we had about 3,200 Pythonists come out. It is broken out into a total of 9 days. The first 2 days are tutorials. They're about 3.5 hours long. You pay for those. There's a fee, and you're in a room with about 30 or 40 people, and you have a teacher and typically some mentors who walk you through a subject of sorts. When the tutorials are over, they have 3 days of actual con, and you have basically 30-minute talks all day, every day for 3 days. We also have lightning talks, which are a blast. For those who haven't sat in a lightning talk, they're 5 minutes long, and they march these folks through there. Guy stands up, has 5 minutes. He gives you some really cool thing, demos a project. He made a widget, whatever. And in 5 minutes, the beeper goes off, and they boot you off the stage. And the next guy stands up and starts speaking. When the conference is officially over, the 3 days of con are over, they have 4 days of sprints. And during the sprints, they break up into individual rooms, and you get a chance to work with professional coders and non-professional coders on open source projects. You can actually work on Python itself if you wanted to. You can work on data science libraries. I worked on 2 projects this year. The first one was a project called Pigments. If you've ever used a tool that displays code and it gives you syntax highlighting, makes like keywords in one color and strings in another color and variables in a third color. In many cases, a tool like Pigments is used to do that. So Pigments has about 400 different languages that it can syntax highlight. And so I grabbed one that it couldn't, and I built a Lexer to try and highlight the colors that are used when you create a graph-of-viz document. And then the next day I went and I worked on Bokeh, which is a data visualization library. And they gave me a problem that was good for beginners, and I tackled it. We'll see that in a bit. They also have 2 things that happen during the tutorial days. They have a language summit that is by invitation only for people who are doing development on Python itself. The core developers, they get them all into a room, and then they argue vigorously about what should be included and what should not be included in the language. They also have an education summit. I was the chairman of that this year. We got educators from around the world into a room on Sunday, and we spent the day talking about, what kinds of things can we do to engage folks of all ages, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about what happened at the Education Summit in a bit. We also have at PyCon a thing called Open Spaces. They very graciously rent out rooms in the conference center, and they allow people to basically take possession of those rooms to do whatever they'd like. And you have a big board, and the board's got these little index cards on it. You say, you know what, we want to do juggling. And you basically mark off that you want to use this room for the next hour for juggling. So you'll meet folks who have interests such as yourself, and you can go and hang out with them in a kind of a birds of a feather type scenario. They do everything under the sun. I think a couple years ago we had mani-pedi day, and somebody blocked off a room and they did manicures and pedicures. They have game board nights or board game nights. They'll rent out the room base, or they'll mark off the room for about 4 or 5 hours, and people from all over the world bring their favorite board games and they share them around and you get to play games. Some people sit down and say, I want to talk to other folks about data science, and they'll have a data science open space. It's pretty cool. PyLadies has a luncheon every year at Pycon. They also have an auction. I think this year we raised over $10,000 for PyLadies. Every year Disney donates a painting for PyLadies to auction off. I think this year they raised about $3,000 on the painting alone. This year they ran a Django Girls workshop to teach women how to create web apps using Django. There's always a job fair at the end of Pycon in case you're looking to get away from your current slave driver. We do a 5K run. They have things called Pycon dinners that you can sign up for at Pycon. They will rent out a restaurant. Actually, they rent out 2 different restaurants, and they choose 2 different menus, and you can sign up to go to one of those. I think it's like $50 to attend the meal. And you get to spend basically 3 hours being entertained by folks from the Python community. They typically have an MC, and he has some sort of activity he's got planned while you eat. You get to meet folks that like Python as much or more than you do. The cost of Pycon is very, very good, actually. It is volunteer run. I think there's like 2 folks who get paid, and everything else is done by volunteers. If you are a student, you can get through the door for $125. If you are just not a student, but you're an individual, you can get in for $350. And if you are kind of flying on a corporate dime, the cost is $600. And that's the full price. If you buy early bird tickets, it's even less than that. And if you're struggling, you know what, even $125 or $350 is too much. You can approach Pycon for financial aid. They gave out over $100,000 of financial aid this year. A lot of those were enough to cover airfare and to get you into Pycon. So they're very good about trying to ensure that they get a wide variety of folks through the door. So there's lots of fun things to do. Your day is completely packed. But in a nutshell, Pycon is really about community, diversity, and family and friends. We have a diversity chair, that's Jessica McKellar, and every year she posts stats to let us know kind of how well we're doing at bringing in diverse audiences. And this year, for the speakers at least, 40% of the speakers were women. And notice in 2011, only 1% of the speakers were female. Right? Now, diversity is not just gender. So she is looking at other ways to try and ensure that the folks who attend Pycon map nicely to the folks who use Pycon or Python. So now let's get into kind of the talks. I'm going to give you a whiz-bang tour of my favorite talks, and we'll just go basically until 6 o'clock. If you have any questions, you're interrupt me at any time. It doesn't bother me at all. I will warn you ahead of time, though. The intent of doing all of these is to give you a nice overview of the kinds of talks that are available. I'm not going to go into any depth. For every single talk, you'll see there's a YouTube link at the bottom. All Pycon talks are available online on YouTube. Matter of fact, they were available within hours of the talk being delivered. That's how efficient they were at getting these talks online. So everyone will have a YouTube link. You can go and listen. The talks are typically about 30 minutes long. I tried to pick what I thought were some of the best. So Guido van Rossum is the guy who created Python 20 plus years ago. And every year he does a keynote and he talks a little bit about what is the state of Python, where are we going, what can you expect. Every year he talks about the 2.7 and the version 3 and where that is headed. First off, he reiterated again this year, there will be no version 2.8 of Python. The end of life party for Python 2.7 has already been planned. You can go to pythonclock.org to count down. We're going to have a party in PyCon 2020. It will be a wild and awesome throwdown affair, so you should plan to be there. And when we say end of life, that's literal. After 2020, there's going to be no more additions to 2.7 unless somebody wants to make a fork and do it themselves. Between now and 2020, the focus is on security fixes and fixing bugs, essentially. No real focus on creating any new features in 2.7, etc. He did talk about version 3.5 and some new things. For those who are into kind of doing mathematics and matrices, they've added a new operator, the @ sign, that will do matrix multiplication. They've added some new unpacking syntax that allows you to take like a list or a tuple and break it out into parts. But they've added some new nuances to that. They've added bytes formatting, which was a big thing in 2. They've added it to 3.5. And they've continued work on typing support. So if you want to be a little bit more like a statically typed language, or a language where you can assess the type of variables, they're continuing to build on that support. His predictions for 3.5, they're going to have a new type of string. And for those who've used Python a lot, you already know that we have like 3 types of strings and 3 different ways to format strings. So yeah, we're going to have a 4th. But it's actually a good thing. And I can show you a demonstration of that a little bit later. 3.6 is going to be out around Christmas. They're going to add a few things like secrets.py for folks who need a little bit more oomph in terms of cryptographic capabilities. Secrets.py is going to be kind of that solution. They've been working very closely with some folks in the cryptographic community so that folks do not have to roll their own cryptography. And Python is moving away from Mercurial, and it's going to move to GitHub. And that is already been kind of tested, and we're just kind of waiting for the final release to be on GitHub. He made a big deal about diversity. Last year, Guido volunteered to help mentor folks who are not the typical male white programmers who wanted to become core developers. And he was pushing to try and have 2 female core developers. Unfortunately, that did not pan out. A number of folks kind of raised their hands. They did get a few patches that were suggested, but nothing really kind of materialized beyond that. So he went and talked to some more folks, and Raymond Hedinger and Brett Cannon, both core developers, as well as Guido, are willing to work with underrepresented folks who want to be core developers of Python. They will be more than happy to mentor you, to help you, and try and get folks lined up to be core devs. The goal is at least 2 female core developers. All right, so that was Guido's talk. The rest of these, we're just going to kind of cruise through. Brett Slatkin gave a very cool talk on refactoring Python. What is refactoring? You write code, you bang it out, it looks good, it works, and then you look back at it and you go, wow, that doesn't look good. And as you try to fix it and improve it, you realize that it's fundamentally kind of broken or fragile. So he walks through a conversation of how do you identify what bad code looks like? What are ways to improve it? How do you run tests against that? How do you then fix and improve those tests? And how do you repeat? And the link for that is there. Dwight Hubbard gave a really cool talk using a Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi, for those who don't know, is a small piece of hardware. It's about 30 bucks. You can actually get a version of Raspberry Pi that's, I think, $5, the Pi Zero. And he walked through how you can take this hardware, develop software using Python on it, and make all sorts of awesome. In particular, he used some temperature sensors, etc., to monitor temperature. He did cover a number of gotchas. He ran into some things as he's working on his project, and he kind of highlights those. One thing to be aware of for this particular video, it was glitchy. The first few minutes are like really crazy. I almost kind of bailed and said, no, I'm not going to bother. But once the glitches kind of worked themselves out, the talk flowed fairly well and looks pretty interesting. I liked it. Nina Sakarenko gave a talk about memory management. She started off with kind of a good overview of the vocabulary associated with memory management in Python. And by memory management, there's this concept of, how much memory is being used, how efficiently are you using it, are you filling up all of your RAM, bottlenecking, are you writing to pages and stuff. So she walked through the vocabulary, she talked about some basic concepts and tried to present things in a way so people would have a foundation. So as they're writing their own code, they can start to think about these memory management concepts. She said up front that, I'm not going to make you a guru or a master in memory management. She says, but I'll basically kind of put you in a framework where you're going to be better able to understand these things and work yourself around them. Or when you go to research them, you'll be better positioned to understand what you're reading when you research. Tracy Osborne, she gave a nice talk on how to do web design for folks who are not designers. And she walked through very specific examples. She kind of threw up a user dialogue, and it was very ugly and very horrible to start off with. And she walked through, all right, well, how do we line things up more efficiently? How do we choose colors that are suitable and match each other in nice, harmonious ways, and yet still highlight things that are important? How do we choose fonts? What is the role of white space in making things more readable and understandable? And for just about each of these things, she gave you some very good web resources to point you in the direction of, how do you pick colors? Here, this is a website that is designed and focused on allowing folks to pick colors. How do you pick good fonts that are going to be usable and viable on the web? She points you to some resources there. So that was pretty slick. Sepperman gave a talk about diffing objects. So to diff a thing is to take one document, for example, and compare it with another and figure out where have lines been added to document A or taken out of document B, et cetera, and how do you figure out where the differences are? And that's all well and good if what you're looking at is text. But what if you're running a script and you are producing variables in memory? How do you look at the difference between your variable today and the variable yesterday? Because knowing the differences between your variables today and yesterday might give you clues as to what is going wrong in your program. So he created a script that walks through your program and basically evaluates all of your objects and helps figure out, hey, wait. Yesterday you ran the script and these were all of your objects that you made. Today you're running the same script. This dictionary, which is deeply nested with other dictionaries and lists inside it, is different at this particular location than what you had yesterday. So it gives you another debugging tool. Let's see. Education Summit was pretty cool. So my keynote speaker for the Education Summit was Nicholas Tollervey. Nicholas lives in the UK. And he brought with him a tool that they are using in the UK to educate kids. And I think I have one here. Yeah. He brought a microbit, and I'll pass it around so you guys can look at it. So this is a microbit. It's a little less than the size of a credit card. It has on the front face 2 buttons, and it has a 5x5 LED matrix. On the back, it has a reset button. It's got a USB port. It's got a power port if you want to plug in like some AA's. It's got a Bluetooth antenna. It's got an accelerometer built into it, so when you move it around, it knows that it's being moved. It's got a compass, so when it rotates, it knows what direction it's pointing in. And it runs Python. It has Python installed on it. It's called MicroPython. It's Python for microprocessors. It has 19 pins on the bottom, so you can put it into a reader. It's got a place for inputting and outputting GPIO signals, so you can basically create hardware devices with it. And in the UK, every 11-year-old child is going to get one of these. They're going to hand out 1 million of these things for every UK kid. And they're going to try and revolutionize how they teach programming to youth. The programming principles that were put into place on this make it very easy to program. It's extremely user-friendly names of variables and things like that. If you want to make the LED, the display, show something, there's a bunch of pre-canned things that you can have it display. But just looking at some of the code behind those gives you hints and ideas of how to display other things. If you want to ask it for, what is your position in space, it's very simple and easy to do that. And to program it, you have 2 options. You can write code in an IED and create a hex file that you just drag and drop, because when you plug it in with a USB, it looks like a flash drive. Just drag and drop it, and it runs. Or you can plug it in with a USB and you can start typing in the Python interface directly. So like I could plug it in and say, hey, display a smiley face. Boom, and the smiley face shows up. Or display in a streaming format this following text string. Hey, my brother Andrew is an idiot. And if you watch Nicholas's talk, you'll understand why we say that my brother Andrew's an idiot. So anyway, the microbit. It's pretty awesome. They will be available for sale very shortly. As soon as all the million kids have gotten one, you'll be able to get one too. A couple other things that we had at the Education Summit. We had some very awesome talks by some folks who are trying to redo how we teach gaming, GPIO, and networking. There are 3 projects out there: Pygame 0, GPI 0, and Network 0. They are all programmed in very much the same fashion as the microbit. They said, look, we've got these very complicated processes, and there's tons and tons of documentation to tell you how to do it, and none of it really makes sense, and everybody bangs their head. So why can't we make this easier? So these group of folks came together, and they created Pygame 0. It simplifies the process of making video games in Python. Network 0 simplifies the process of making network connections. And GPI 0 simplifies the process of basically plugging in hardware and getting the inputs and the outputs to work. And it puts it in terms that are easy to understand, etc. If you're an educator and you want to be involved in the Python education ecosystem, you can Google EduSig info and Python edu-working group info, and it'll take you to the mailing list for both of those. The difference between the two of them, they're both run by essentially the Python Software Foundation, but one of them is, hey, we do education conversations, cool. And the Python EDU WG, those are supposed to be working groups. They're supposed to be focused on very specific projects. Hey, we would like to make a IDE like IDLE that is actually useful for students and beginners, or we want to create a particular type of curriculum and work together to do that. So. All right, moving on. Ms. Ria gave a presentation on discovering Python through music and how she took a passion of her own and used Python libraries to explore that passion and teach herself Python. So I highly recommend that you go watch that. And she's turning red right now. So once you've watched it, tell her how awesome it is. Excellent. My friend Naomi, and I'll say straight up front, I ride on Naomi's coattails. Naomi created the Python Education Summit that I've been chairing. So I owe all of my success to her. She gave a very good talk about diversity and areas where we in the tech community get it wrong in terms of trying to get greater diversity, whether it be diversity at places like Pycon or diversity in companies. So her talk was pretty slick. I liked that. Francis and Patrick gave a very nice overview of IPython/Jupyter notebooks. If I remember right, they both work for Yelp, and they use these notebooks in Yelp to create evaluations and workflows that they can share freely with other folks so that people can see their code, see the results, and see kind of the documentation, the report that goes around those results. And they gave some ideas on gotchas, where things failed and went wrong, and some good examples. If you've never used an IPython notebook, this is a really good introduction to what an IPython notebook is and why they're cool. Let's see. Ned Batchelder, he works for OpenEdX, and he walked through, these starting to get more complicated talks. He walked through debugging. When your program doesn't work, a lot of times it's very hard to figure out what's not working. Python is a dynamic language, which means your variable can change into a very wide variety of things, and you may not even know that it's changed in the background. But what that means is that sometimes Python can be very chaotic. So he talks about how this chaos gets us into a problem where we can't figure out what's going on. And then he talks about how, because that's true, and it is a dynamic language, we can use that dynamicism, if that's a real word, to get us out of those problems. And he then walked through I think 3 or 4 real projects and real problems that he experienced in his workplace. All right. Pythons in a container. Dorian gave a talk about Docker, and since we had a Docker conversation just a couple weeks ago with Kelsey Hightower from Google, I figured some folks might want to follow up on that and get a look at Docker again, right? And one thing that Dorian mentioned was, as he was learning to use Docker containers and setting up workflows and using tools to help him in his development operations, there were certain Python patterns that didn't seem to make sense anymore. So he had to kind of like back away from certain Pythonic things. So that might be interesting for folks who are into Docker. All right. This talk was quite entertaining. So Scott and Joe stood up and they gave a conversation on bytecode. When Python is executed, it creates a thing called bytecode in the background. And it's the bytecode that is doing a lot of the magic. And when I said this talk is entertaining, they stood up and they come on to, one of these guys comes on the stage and he's like, hey, Joe Schmo was supposed to be here to give this talk and he couldn't, but he sent me his notes. So I'm going to try and walk you through this based on what I was able to skim from his notes. This is entirely a joke, right? And apparently, Aiden, you were in the audience, right? Somebody in the front of the room was trying to help this guy, not realizing that it was a complete joke.
No, that's not what happened. The second guy came up, and then with him, they did the rest of the...
I talked to these guys afterwards in the bookstore, and they said that somebody in the audience up front was trying to like give him hints. Yeah. So somebody in the audience was trying to give this guy hints, thinking that he actually really wasn't the right speaker, and he was really trying to fake this. But anyway, as Aiden mentioned, partway through, the other guy, I don't remember if it was Joe or Scott, did get up, and they were trying to walk through this. But long story short, as you start to advance in your understanding of Python, getting a better understanding of what is happening behind the scenes can be really useful. And these guys did it in a very playful and entertaining way. So Susan's talk was a lot about, when somebody hands you a big pile of code and it's all spaghetti and all this, and you have no idea where to start, that can be very daunting and can make it more difficult for you to figure out, what you're supposed to do, especially if you start in a new job or you're trying to tackle a new project and you've never done that before. So she took a library called Requests, and she walked through that library. And she gave you some hints on how you can look at other people's code and make sense of it. How do you set up your development environment so it's easy to navigate through the code? Like, oh, here's a variable. Let me go figure out where that variable was defined in a very simple and efficient way. And then she kind of walked through this, building up a mental working model of the code base. So that was fun. Click was one of my favorite talks. If you've ever built a command line application where you want to give it arguments to tell the program to do something different, if you're going to make a CLI interface, your options were optparse, which was deprecated, and then argparse, which is in the standard library, or doctopt. And there's Click. Sebastian walks through an example of argparse and docopt, talks a little bit about the pros and cons of each. I will say I did like docopt. It was very, very slick. And then he walks through Click, and he talks about making options for your program, setting defaults in your program, subcommands and how you can nest subcommands within each other, how you can have global settings in your script, and then how you can create like help and user documentation in a very easy and efficient way. And I do a lot of kind of scripts like this where I'm running them on the command line as opposed to web apps. So for me, this is really useful. Anthony's talk on conch. Yeah, it's spelled X-O-N-S-H, but it's pronounced conch. It is a Pythonish bashwords looking shell language and a command prompt. So if you've ever used Linux or the Mac and you use something like bash, or if you used Z shell, the purpose and idea behind conch is to take Python, which is easy and simple to use, and a bunch of the best parts of Bash, Fish, and Z Shell and munge them all together. So you can actually do command line types of things that you do in Bash and interweave that with Python code. So your favorite Bash commands will still work. Your favorite Python functions will still work, and you can run them and type them right on the command line. You don't even have to open a Python interpreter. It just runs. It uses a superset of Python 3.4. It also includes a lot of the cool things that are in IPython. I have not installed it on my machine yet, but it's on the to-do list. It looks pretty slick. Grant Jenks gave a really cool talk. If you ever look at the Python libraries, you have collections like lists and stuff. Sorted collections are not very well represented. If you go to C++, Java, .NET, they all have libraries that do this fairly well, but Python does not provide us with that sort of love. So your big options are to go to PyPI and to look through this menagerie of random libraries that purport to do this. So Grant went and did all the hard work for you. He downloaded basically all of them, and he created a whole series of test suites and ran metrics against all of them to see which ones handle sorting best, most efficiently. It's got a ton of graphs to show how this, and this perform, and he dives very deeply into some of the nuances behind sorting. And then he talks about his library and how it performs. And he highlights the places where other libraries do better than his own and where his does better than those. And in most cases, his performed better. He got, it's all written in pure Python, so if you needed to tweak something, you can very easily. But in almost every case, it's just as fast as C extensions. And like I said, he's got a ton of benchmarking. It was very slick. And it was very cool because he was talking and he's like, so-and-so core developer had this particular library and it does this thing, and that core developer is sitting there in the audience listening to his talk. And they immediately stepped out in the hallway afterwards and had a very nice conversation about where to go with this. I would not be surprised if some of these items from Grant's library end up in the standard library at some point. They were pretty slick. Russell Keith McGee gave a talk on cell phones. He is one of the core developers for Beware. So if you want to make a Python app on Android or iOS, Beware is one of those tools you can use. Kivy is another. There's a couple other places you can look. One of the primary focuses of Beware is that when you make an app using Beware and you're going to put it on Android, it should look like Android. If you're going to put an app on iOS, it should look like iOS, right? Some of the interfaces and the attempts that people have used to do apps on phones have been very clunky and kind of, they didn't really match the user experience that the user expects on that platform. So Beware's focus is, as much as possible, everything that comes out of your Python app should be and look and feel just like Android or iOS. Basically, the ambition of Beware is to take all the awesome that we have in terms of being able to simply and easily make web frameworks and model that so we can simply and easily make mobile frameworks. And I think this is one of the last things we got. So there's a thing called the global interpreter lock. It was introduced about 24 years ago into Python, and it revolves around handling Python execution on a single CPU. But that really hoses up because very few computers nowadays have a single CPU. Most of them have multiple CPUs. This global interpreter lock basically kind of locks you into running on a single CPU. And that means that we don't get the performance that we might want out of Python in a multi-CPU scenario. So Larry Hastings went and took the GIL out and performed a GILectomy. Didn't break everything, broke some things, but did not break everything. Python without the GIL has some problems, but they spent about 4 days working on trying to produce a GIL-less version of Python. So the expectation is that as Larry and company kind of work out some of these kinks, we may very soon have a really robust version of Python that will run on multiple CPUs. So that's pretty exciting. Huh?
Just read today.
Yeah.
A
Larry has one, and he even said, I've taken the gill out and it works. But again, there's parts that are broken, right? So it's not an easy problem. But hopefully they'll get there, because that'll open up a lot of doors for Python. I mean, even mobile phones nowadays have multiple cores. So, all right. And I think that's about it. Oh, the sprints. The sprints were awesome. I was working on Bokeh, and I got one of my first official commits ever on a public project, so I was pretty excited by that. At Pycon, what they did for the sprints, on Sunday night, they had a sprint workshop. They got a bunch of folks in a room, and they said, look, for those of you who've never worked on an open source project, don't be scared. We will introduce you some vocabulary. We will walk you through what some of these things mean so that you're not surprised by them when Monday starts and you sit down to work with a professional developer. So we had a series of workshops. We talked about things like virtual environments and things like Git and version control, etc. And then on Monday, we had a bunch of folks walking around with stickers on their chest saying, I am a Sprint ambassador. If you are confused, if you do not know what you're doing, if you want some help, come over. You are not bothering me. You're not interfering with me. I am here to help you. So basically every room had 6 to 10 different teams working on different projects. Some teams were like 2 folks, some teams were 30, but every room had Sprint ambassadors to kind of make the process simpler for people to be able to help with open source projects. So that was pretty amazing. It was pretty slick. And we had hundreds of people there working on open source stuff. And we had probably, rough guess, 50 different projects that people were sprinting on. And that's it. So that's that. Whirlwind tour of PyCon. A lot of the similar style talks will be at Pi Ohio in the end of July if you guys want to go to that. And if you can't make it to Pi Ohio, there are Python conferences all over the world. I know they're looking at getting some speakers for PyCon India. Some folks were tweeting about that earlier today. PyData has conferences about every month and a half. SciPy conference happens, I think, once a year. So there's a lot of conferences you could go to, and many of them kind of follow the PyCon model. And if you can't make any of those, save up your pennies, save up your dimes, and hope to see you at PyCon next year. It's a blast. It's a good time.